He was one of the richest men in the Middle East, but no wealth could replace the son he lost 25 years ago. Then one day, at a construction site, he froze. A black laborer stood before him. His movements, his gaze, his presence felt achingly familiar. And then he saw it, the bracelet, the very same one his boy wore the day he disappeared. What followed was a discovery so shocking it would change both of their lives forever. Stay with us, because this story will take you on a journey you'll never forget. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun burned against the rising steel of Manhattan's latest skyscraper, its beams gleaming like the skeleton of a giant. Workers shouted, cranes groaned, and dust clung to the sweat-soaked bodies of men who knew what it meant to labor for survival. Among them was Malik Johnson, a 28-year-old black man whose calloused hands and strong back had carried him through a life of endless struggle. He wore no suit, no badge of status, just a hard hat, gloves worn thin, and the pride of someone who refused to break under the weight of circumstances. At his side, two fellow workers argued about the safest way to secure a load of beams, worried that a single mistake could crush lives in seconds. Malik, who had grown up watching construction crews in Brooklyn and learning from his own experiences on countless sites, spoke with quiet certainty. He pointed to the cables and explained that the tension wasn't distributed properly. If you release that crane here, the load will swing. We need to adjust or someone's getting hurt. His voice carried not arrogance but concern, a tone sharpened by years of watching men injured because no one listened. But his words drew only scorn. Ethan Cole, the foreman, was a man whose authority thrived on fear. At 45, with a cigarette dangling from his lips and contempt embedded in his sneer, he lived for moments like this, moments where he could remind workers of their place. He turned on Malik with a mocking laugh that echoed across the girders. Listen to him. A laborer thinks he's an engineer now. His voice grew harsher. You're nothing but a mule, Johnson. Keep your mouth shut and carry what you're told. The other workers froze, heads lowered. They had all tasted Ethan's cruelty at one point, but today his venom was sharper, more deliberate. Malik stood firm, jaw tight, but he said nothing more. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of someone who had learned that survival sometimes demanded restraint. Ethan, unsatisfied, barked a command meant not just to silence Malik, but to humiliate him beyond repair. You like to act smart? Fine. Carry those bags of cement up to the 10th floor, alone, every last one. And if you can't do it, you can collect your last paycheck and get out. The demand was absurd. Each bag weighed more than most men could bear for long, and to haul them up 10 floors of scaffolding alone was cruel punishment. The workers shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared speak. To challenge Ethan was to risk losing a day's wage, and wages were the difference between rent paid and eviction notices. Malik's throat burned with anger, but pride anchored his response. He nodded once, hoisted the first bag onto his shoulder, and began the climb. His boots pressed into the steel rungs of the ladder, each step echoing with defiance. The men below watched, their silence heavy with shame. They knew this wasn't about cement or orders. It was about breaking a man's spirit in front of his peers. And yet, Malik climbed. His breath was steady, his muscles straining, but he did not yield. Inside the glass-paneled trailer overlooking the site, Kareem Al-Farouk sat at a polished mahogany desk, reviewing contracts worth billions. At 58, he was a man who had conquered skylines, reshaping New York with towers that bore his name. His company, Al-Farouk Global Developments, was synonymous with power, precision, and wealth beyond imagination. People called him ruthless, efficient, a builder of dreams who left no time for sentiment. But on this morning, his pen stilled. His gaze lifted to the figure climbing the scaffold, with the weight of cement crushing his back. Something about that young man, his stubborn refusal to surrender, the way he tilted his head, in determination, even the line of his jaw, pierced Kareem in a way nothing had in decades. Kareem's chest tightened, Against his will, memory intruded. He saw a small boy with wide, curious eyes, always asking how the world fit together. He remembered the child's laughter as he tried to mimic workers on toy blocks, his endless questions about cranes and beams. That boy's name was Laith, his son, the son he had lost 25 years ago when his wife walked out of their home in Detroit, leaving nothing behind but silence. For years, Kareem had buried those memories under contracts and skyscrapers. But here, on this construction site, they roared back to life. Then he saw it, the glint of gold on the young man's wrist as he adjusted the bag of cement. Kareem's breath caught. A bracelet. Not just any bracelet, but one with Arabic script engraved across its small plate. Kareem's heart lurched. He knew it instantly, for he had designed it himself all those years ago. One for his son to wear, one for himself to keep, a promise of bond and belonging. His knuckles whitened around his pen. He rose from his chair, ignoring the startled voice of his assistant, Isabella Ruiz, who reminded him that investors were waiting for his presentation downtown. Kareem's voice was a low growl. "Cancel the meeting. I need to see this site. Now." Without waiting, he pushed open the door and strode into the dust and clamor below. Kareem Al-Farouk stepped down from the trailer with the heavy stillness of a man who had carried too many secrets for too long. Every stride drew the eyes of workers who had never before seen the billionaire owner on the ground with them. He was a figure they knew only from company newsletters, magazine covers, or the giant photos framed in lobbies. Now he was walking through the dust in a perfectly pressed suit, shoulders squared, jaw tight, and eyes fixed on one man. The laborers set down their tools, pretending to check scaffolding or sweep the gravel, but their curiosity betrayed them. To see the richest man in the city descend into the mess of a construction site was a story they would tell at dinner tables for weeks. Even the crane operator leaned out of his cab, craning his neck to see what was happening. The foreman, Ethan Cole's smirk wavered as the presence of his employer cut through the yard like a blade. But Kareem was not looking at Ethan, nor at the men who stopped their work. His eyes were locked on Malik Johnson, who was inching his way up the scaffolding with the second bag of cement on his back. Malik's breathing was shallow, his arms quivering with strain, but his expression was carved from stone. He refused to drop the burden, even though everyone knew the punishment had been designed to break him. Kareem felt something stir in his chest, something he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. That quiet defiance, that refusal to bow to humiliation, it was hauntingly familiar. His mind, unbidden, began to drift backward. He remembered a house in Detroit 25 years earlier, small and modest, but filled with warmth. His wife, Amina, had been a woman of quiet strength, her laughter carrying through. The kitchen as she prepared meals while their little boy played at her feet. The boy, Laith, had been curious about everything. Kareem could still see him holding toy cranes and blocks, peppering him with endless questions about how buildings stood tall and how bridges carried cars. "Later, when you're older," Kareem had always said, brushing the child's hair with absent-minded affection before rushing out to another meeting. The ambition that drove Kareem to build his empire had also been the poison that hollowed his home. Late nights in the office piled up, dinners were missed, promises forgotten. Amina's pleas for attention turned into arguments, and one night after another clash about his neglect, she was gone. Kareem had come home to silence. Laith's shoes no longer sat by the door. The toys were gone. Even the photo frames on the wall were bare. Amina had left, and she had taken his son with her. What followed was a quarter-century of searching. Kareem spent millions hiring private detectives, placing advertisements in newspapers, and following any lead, no matter how faint. Some said they saw a woman and child in Chicago, others in Atlanta, others in Houston. Each time the trail went cold, the emptiness that followed never healed. Kareem filled it with towers of steel and glass, with contracts and deals. But the wound remained open. Only one thing kept him tethered to the memory of his boy. When Laith turned 3, Kareem had commissioned a goldsmith to create a pair of bracelets. Thin chains with small plates engraved with the name Laith in flowing Arabic letters. One was for his son, The other Karim kept in a velvet box, a symbol of a bond that should have endured. After Amina left, Karim would sit with that bracelet in his hand, wondering where its twin had gone. Now, standing in the grit and noise of the construction yard, his eyes caught the glint of gold on Malik's wrist. His breath stilled. It was not just any bracelet, it was the bracelet. The plate gleamed faintly, and though the dust and distance blurred his view, Karim knew what it said. Laith, his son's name, etched in Arabic letters. The impossible was standing right in front of him. Behind him, his assistant Isabella Ruiz hurried down the steps, clutching a folder and speaking quickly. Sir, the investors are already waiting downtown. The delegation from Dubai has flown in for this meeting. London partners are on the call. If you miss this, it will cost us billions. Karim's voice was flat, his eyes never leaving Malik. Cancel it. Sir, I said cancel it. His tone left no room for argument. Isabella faltered, realizing that whatever had seized his attention mattered more to him than billions. Ethan Cole flicked his cigarette to the dirt and barked with his usual arrogance, trying to reclaim the moment. Look at him, he shouted, his voice carrying across the site. The hero thinks he's stronger than the rest of us. Let's see how long before he breaks. A few of the men forced nervous laughs, but most remained quiet, shame etched in their faces. They all knew Ethan's cruelty. Today he had simply chosen Malik as his target. Karim's fists curled at his sides. For decades he had maintained the mask of a businessman who bowed to nothing. But the sight of his own blood being degraded was more than he could endure. His voice thundered across the yard with a force that stopped even the machines. Cole! The foreman spun around, startled, nearly choking on his own breath. His face drained of color when he saw who had called his name. Mr. Al-Farouk, I didn't know you were here today. Everything is fine. Everything is under control. Karim advanced slowly, his gaze hard enough to cut steel. Under control. He gestured toward Malik, who had just collapsed onto a platform, the cement bag sliding from his back. Explain why a laborer carries alone what a team should share, while your men stand idle. Ethan's words stumbled over themselves. It's just discipline, sir. He needed to be taught his place. Karim's voice dropped into a tone that froze the air. Discipline or humiliation? The silence was unbearable. Dozens of workers who had long avoided eye contact now turned openly to watch. For years, Ethan Cole had ruled through fear. But now, with a few words, the balance of power shifted. Yet Karim wasn't looking at Ethan anymore. His eyes were drawn back to Malik, to the bracelet that glimmered in, the sunlight, to the stubborn defiance in the young man's stance. His voice softened, though urgency edged every syllable. Where did you get that bracelet? Malik blinked, caught off guard. He instinctively moved his hand to cover it, as though to shield a memory too personal to share. His answer came cautiously. It was my mother's. She gave it to me when I was little, said it was the only thing left of my father. Karim's heart slammed against his ribs. His lips parted, the next question barely a whisper. Your mother's name? Amina Johnson, Malik said after a pause. His voice grew firmer. But before she married my stepfather, she said her name was Amina El-Farouk. Why are you asking? The world tilted. For a moment, all Karim could hear was the pounding of his own pulse. The workers exchanged glances, sensing that something extraordinary had just unfolded. Ethan Cole stared in confusion, unable to process the shift. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth, her face pale with shock. Karim steadied himself, forcing control back into his trembling voice. You, he said, his eyes fixed on Malik. Come with me. Now. Ethan stumbled forward, panic in his tone. Sir, please, if I can explain. Karim didn't even turn to him. His command cut through the silence. You're finished. Collect your things. Security will escort you out. Human resources will handle your termination. The entire site gasped softly. The foreman who had tormented them for years had been dismissed in an instant. The balance of fear shifted permanently. Karim turned again to Malik, his face taut with an emotion he could no longer mask. We talk in my office, he said. Malik hesitated, his pulse quickening. Confusion tangled with suspicion, yet something in Kareem's tone left no room for refusal. Slowly he followed, the bracelet on his wrist feeling heavier than it ever had before, as though the truth it carried was finally demanding to be heard. The ride to the executive tower was silent, but the air inside the black sedan was thick with questions Malik couldn't bring himself to ask. He sat rigid in the leather seat, his calloused hands folded awkwardly in his lap, sweat and dust still clinging to his shirt. Across from him, Kareem Al-Farouk sat in immaculate stillness, his eyes fixed, not on the skyline that blurred past the window, but on Malik himself. The billionaire's expression was unreadable, yet his gaze carried the intensity of a man staring at a ghost. Malik felt uneasy under that scrutiny. In his life, he had always been the one invisible, overlooked as just another laborer who could be replaced with the flick of a pen. Now suddenly the most powerful man in New York was studying him as if every detail mattered. He wanted to break the silence, to demand answers, but his pride kept his jaw clenched. The bracelet on his wrist felt hotter than usual, as though it knew before he did that it was the key to a story unraveling. When the car finally pulled into the underground garage of the Al-Farouk Global headquarters, Malik was struck by the sheer size of the tower above them. He had labored on buildings like this his entire adult life, yet he had never imagined setting foot inside one as anything but a worker covered in cement dust. The lobby they entered was a cathedral of glass and marble, with ceilings so high they seemed to scrape the clouds. Men in suits glanced curiously at the grimy laborer walking beside their employer, but no one dared speak. Kareem led Malik to a private elevator, accessible only with a fingerprint scan. As the doors closed, Malik caught his own reflection in the mirrored walls, broad shoulders, worn boots, skin darkened by years of sun. Beside him stood a man in an immaculate suit, face carved by wealth and power. They could not have looked more different, yet something in their features, a line of the jaw, a tilt of the brow, seemed eerily mirrored. Malik looked away, unsettled. The elevator opened onto the top floor, where the penthouse office stretched like an empire in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city sprawling endlessly below. Polished mahogany shelves groaned with books and awards. A massive desk sat in the center, but it was the smaller details that struck Malik. The framed photographs, the velvet, boxes arranged carefully on a glass shelf, and the quiet hum of a life lived above the noise of the streets. Kareem gestured for Malik to sit, his own movements betraying a tension that no fortune could mask. Malik lowered himself into a leather chair, feeling out of place, as though the dirt on his clothes might stain the wealth surrounding him. He wanted to leave, to escape the strange intensity pressing in from every corner of the room. But he also wanted to know, needed to know, why this man looked at him as though he were the answer to a question asked decades ago. Without speaking, Kareem walked to the far wall, pressed a hidden panel, and unlocked a small safe. His hands, usually so steady in boardrooms, trembled slightly as he retrieved a velvet box. He placed it carefully on the desk between them, pushing it toward Malik. "Before I open this," he said quietly, "I need you to listen." Malik frowned, his suspicion rising. "Listen to what? I don't even know why I'm here. If this is about me questioning your foreman, This has nothing to do with Cole," Kareem interrupted sharply. His tone softened almost immediately, his gaze fixed on the bracelet around Malik's wrist. "This has to do with that." Malik instinctively touched the chain, fingers brushing the engraved plate. "What about it?" "It was my mother's. She said it belonged to my father, the man who abandoned us. That's all I know." Kareem inhaled deeply, his voice tightening. "Your mother's name was Amina." Malik's heart jolted. "How do you know that?" "Because she was my wife." Kareem's words fell like stones in the silence. Malik froze, his breath caught, his mind racing. He wanted to laugh, to accuse the man of some cruel manipulation. Yet something in Kareem's eyes, something raw and unguarded, told him this wasn't a lie. His stomach knotted as he leaned forward. "My mother, she said my father left us. She said he chose money and business over family." Kareem's eyes glistened, but his voice was steady. That is not the truth. She left me. I came home one night, and you were gone. I searched for you, for her, for years. I spent everything I had, money, connections, influence. But she hid well, too well, and he faltered, lowering his gaze for the first time. I failed to bring you home. He opened the velvet box with trembling hands. Inside lay a small gold bracelet, identical to the one Malik wore, engraved with the name Laith in Arabic letters. Malik's world tilted as he stared at it. It was impossible, yet undeniable. The same chain, the same engraving, two halves of a truth colliding after 25 years. That was your name, Kareem whispered. Before you became Malik Johnson, you were Laith al-Farouk.
My son.
The words crashed into Malik with violent force. He shoved back his chair, the legs scraping against the polished floor. No, my mother told me you abandoned us. She never spoke your name except with bitterness. She raised me alone, while you lived in towers like this. His voice broke with fury. Why should I believe you now? Kareem reached for a thick folder from the safe, sliding it across the desk. Because I can prove it. Malik hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were photographs, grainy images of himself as a toddler playing in a yard, missing person posters with his face, receipts from detectives, newspaper clippings offering rewards, reports of sightings, travels across states, and year after year of fruitless searching. Each page was a wound laid bare, evidence of a man who had not stopped looking. Malik's throat tightened. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but anger rose just as swiftly. Why didn't you find us? If you searched so hard, why didn't you? Kareem's voice broke because she changed her name. She created a new life, buried herself in shadows. I thought she might have remarried, that perhaps you were being raised by another man who gave you his name. And his hands clenched. I was too late every time. Malik pressed his palms to his temples, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the city beyond the windows. Everything he had believed, that his father had abandoned him, that his mother had carried the weight alone, was unraveling. The ground beneath him no longer felt solid. At that moment, Isabella returned quietly, holding an envelope. She looked at Kareem, then at Malik, her expression hesitant. Sir, she said softly, the test results are here. Malik blinked, confused. Test results? Kareem met his gaze, his voice hoarse. I ordered a DNA test. I had to be certain before I said the words. It was taken this morning while you were still at the site. Isabella placed the envelope on the desk. Kareem opened it with shaking fingers, scanning quickly before setting it down where Malik could see. The words burned into his vision. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. The silence that followed was unbearable. Malik's chest heaved as he stared at the numbers, the proof that tore down every wall he had built around his identity. He was not just Malik Johnson, the overlooked laborer from Brooklyn. He was Laith al-Farouk, son of a billionaire he had hated without knowing. His voice cracked as he whispered, This can't be real. Kareem's own eyes brimmed with tears. For the first time in decades, the armor of the ruthless mogul fell away. He reached across the desk, his hand trembling. It is real. You are my son, my blood, my Laith. Malik recoiled, standing abruptly. Don't call me that. I don't even know you. You built an empire while I carried cement. You sat in glass towers while my mother worked herself sick. Do you know what it's like to go hungry? To be told your father didn't want you? You don't get to show up now and rewrite the story. His voice thundered with years of buried pain. Kareem did not flinch at the anger. His own tears slid unchecked down his face. I cannot rewrite the past, but I can give you the truth. And I can give you what was always yours, a place in this family, and a chance to heal what was broken. Malik turned away, staring out the window at the endless city. His reflection in the glass blurred with Kareem's beside him. Father and son stood in silence, bound by truth and torn by years of absence. And in that silence, The storm of the past finally began to break. The silence in the penthouse office lingered until it became suffocating. Malik stood by the window, staring down at the city that stretched like a labyrinth beneath him. He had worked on those very streets, carrying loads of rebar, mixing cement, breaking his body for wages that barely kept him afloat. Now the man who claimed to be his father stood just a few feet away, speaking of family, truth, and blood. Kareem remained seated, but his mind was already moving with a kind of sharp clarity. Years of command had honed him into a man of action, and the revelation of his son's return had awoken something fierce within him. He could not erase the past, but he could make sure no one else added to the scars Malik carried. He pressed a button on his desk, his voice suddenly hard, regaining the edge of authority. "Isabella, bring me legal." Within minutes, 2 senior lawyers from Al Farouk Global entered, confused but attentive. Kareem didn't waste time. He laid out what had happened on the site, the humiliation, the unsafe orders, the racial harassment Malik endured. His tone carried no hesitation. "I want a full investigation into Ethan Cole's record, every worker he has abused, every complaint that was buried. I want lawsuits drafted for harassment, discrimination, and endangerment. He will not walk away from this." The lawyers exchanged wary glances. One spoke cautiously. "Sir, that could cost millions in damages if the cases open up. It could also draw media scrutiny." "Are you sure you—" "I don't care about cost," Kareem cut in, his voice sharp. "The cost is nothing compared to the years this man took from my son and the dignity he tried to strip from him today. Money will not save Cole from accountability. Make an example of him. Let the entire industry see what happens when you humiliate a man for the color of his skin or the weight of his background." Malik turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You already fired him. Isn't that enough? Why drag it further?" His tone carried suspicion, but also unease. Kareem met his gaze with a steadiness that was both paternal and unyielding. "Firing him only removes him from this building. Exposing him ensures he cannot do to others what he did to you. This is not vengeance. This is justice. For you and for every man who suffered under him." Malik wanted to argue, but part of him knew the truth in Kareem's words. He thought of the men on the site who had lowered their eyes, too afraid to intervene. They had all endured Ethan's cruelty in silence. Perhaps, for them, seeing justice done would matter. Still, Malik's pride wrestled with the idea of being defended by a man he had just met, a man who claimed the title of father after 25 years of absence. The following day, the construction site buzzed with whispers. News spread quickly. Ethan Cole had been escorted off the grounds, stripped of his badge, his name removed from the roster. By noon, the men received word that Kareem himself had ordered an independent review of workplace conditions. For the first time in years, workers lifted their heads with something close to hope. By the end of the week, the media caught wind. Headlines splashed across news feeds. "Supervisor humiliates laborer. Turns out to be billionaire's son." Reporters camped outside the gates, desperate for photos of Malik. The story traveled fast, shared on social media, dissected on talk shows. Ethan's face, once smug with authority, became the symbol of workplace prejudice. Companies across the city quietly blacklisted him, not wanting the stain of his reputation. Malik found himself at the center of a storm he had never asked for. On the street, people pointed, whispering, some with admiration, others with envy. Journalists called him a modern-day Cinderella, plucked from obscurity into the palace of wealth. But Malik felt none of the fairy tale. To him, it was chaos, his life ripped open, his privacy gone, his every step shadowed by cameras. In the office, Kareem moved swiftly. He assigned Isabella to protect Malik from the press and to manage his affairs. Malik bristled at the attention, unused to being fussed over, but Kareem insisted. "They will come for you now. Some will want to praise you. Others will want to tear you down. You must be prepared." Malik's anger simmered. "Prepared? You think money prepares someone for this? You think suits and press conferences will erase the years I spent being told I was worthless? Where were you then?" Kareem did not flinch at the accusation. His eyes softened, the voice of a man who had carried regret too long. I was searching, Malik. Failing, yes, but searching. Every day, every year I looked for you. And I cannot erase the hunger, the hardship, the nights you spent wondering why your father did not want you. But I am here now, and I will not let you face this world alone again. The words hung between them, heavy with both promise and doubt. Malik turned away, wrestling with emotions he could not name. Trust was not built in a day. Blood did not erase years of absence. But in Kareem's voice he heard something his heart recognized, sincerity perhaps, or a plea for forgiveness. Later that evening, Malik sat alone in the guest suite of the tower, staring at the bracelet on his wrist. He traced the engraved letters with his thumb, the name that tied him to a father he was only beginning to understand. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Your father left us. He didn't care. Yet here was proof that her story had not been the full truth. And as the city lights flickered against the glass walls, Malik realized that the storm he was caught in was only the beginning. Justice had been set in motion for Ethan Cole, but the real battle was inside him, the battle to reconcile the man who had raised him with lies and the man who claimed him with truth. The following weeks unfolded like a storm Malik could not escape. One day he was hauling cement up scaffolding under a foreman's cruelty. The next he was standing in the marble lobby of Al Farouk Global, cameras flashing at his face as reporters shouted questions. The story of a laborer, revealed to be the long-lost son of a billionaire, had ignited every news cycle. Headlines painted him as a prodigal heir, while talk shows debated whether he was prepared for the life that had been dropped into his lap. Malik felt less like a man and more like a spectacle. Kareem, however, had no intention of letting the chaos drown his son. He moved decisively, announcing that Malik would join the company in a leadership role. It shocked the industry, unsettled investors, and angered executives who had clawed their way up the hierarchy only to see a laborer leap past them. Kareem silenced their protests with a single command. He is my son. He belongs here. But Malik was not ready to wear the crown so easily. The first time Kareem walked him through the executive floor, Malik's boots echoed too loudly on the polished marble. He felt the eyes of men in tailored suits following him, eyes sharp with doubt, some with open disdain. A few whispered just loud enough for him to hear. He was carrying bags of cement last month, and now he's a vice president? Malik clenched his fists, the temptation to turn and confront them burning hot, but he swallowed it. His pride would not let them see him rattled. Kareem noticed. He leaned closer as they walked. They doubt you because they don't know you yet. Let them. Prove them wrong not with anger, but with action. Malik's voice was tight. And what if I fail? Kareem stopped, turning to him with a gaze that bore the weight of decades. Then you fail as my son, not as a stranger, and that difference means you rise again. The words lingered with Malik as he began his uneasy transition. Kareem did not hand him power outright. Instead, he insisted Malik spend his days shadowing site supervisors, project managers, and architects. Malik attended safety briefings and walked through designs with engineers, not as a guest but as a participant. His rough knowledge of construction, the kind learned by carrying beams, not by reading textbooks, proved unexpectedly valuable. He pointed out flaws in plans others overlooked, simple but practical insights that only a laborer would notice. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to stir. Still, the climb was brutal. In meetings, Malik faced skeptical investors who questioned Kareem's judgment. One particularly sharp voice came from an older man named Douglas Hayward, an American financier who had poured millions into Al Farouk projects. At a board meeting packed with men in suits, Hayward leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with condescension. With respect, Mr. Al Farouk, we are risking billions by placing trust in a man who was, what, mixing cement a few weeks ago? This is not a charity. This is global business. The room tensed. Malik sat rigid, heat rising in his chest. His instincts screamed to lash out, to remind them he had bled on those very sites while they sat behind polished desks. But Kareem's warning echoed in his mind, prove them wrong with action. Malik inhaled slowly, then leaned forward. His voice was steady, not loud, but firm enough to silence the murmurs. "You think carrying cement makes me unqualified," he said. "But that cement is the foundation under every tower you brag about in these meetings. I know what it's like to work 12 hours in freezing wind for pay that barely feeds a family. I know what corners are cut when no one is watching. And I know what it means to be humiliated by men who think laborers are disposable." His gaze swept across the room. "That perspective doesn't make me a risk. It makes me an asset. Because the future of this company isn't in glass towers alone. It's in the people who build them." The room fell quiet. A few eyes flicked toward Kareem, who sat back with the faintest trace of a smile. Hayward shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing more. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the first time Malik felt the weight of his voice in a room of men who had dismissed him. Kareem wasted no time channeling that momentum. He placed Malik at the head of a new initiative, a laborer-to-leadership program designed to recruit skilled workers from construction sites, provide them with education, and promote them into managerial roles. It was unprecedented, and many called it reckless. But Malik threw himself into it with a fire born of lived experience. He visited sites personally, speaking to men who reminded him of himself. He told them their knowledge mattered, that their sweat and pain could translate into leadership if given the chance. Some laughed at the idea, too hardened by years of neglect to believe in change. Others listened, hope flickering in their eyes. Malik wrote policies that demanded safer conditions, stricter protections against harassment, and training workshops to turn laborers into foremen and foremen into supervisors. Educational elements flowed naturally into his work. Malik drew on his years of carrying beams to explain load distribution, showing men how the smallest miscalculation could cause accidents. He introduced safety seminars on scaffolding stability and protective gear, insisting that no worker should ever be forced to risk life just to keep a job. And for the first time, he felt purpose not just in carrying cement, but in lifting men out of the shadows he had once lived in. But success did not erase his doubts. Late at night, Malik would sit in the quiet of his suite, staring at the bracelet, remembering his mother's voice. She had told him his father abandoned them, and for years he believed it. Now Kareem claimed the opposite, that she had left, taking him into hiding. Which was the truth? Could both be true in some fractured way? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Even as he began to carve a place in the company, he felt the weight of unfinished stories pressing down on him. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with investors who still doubted him, Malik stormed into Kareem's office, anger etched across his face. "They don't want me here. They look at me and see a laborer pretending to be a prince, and part of me agrees with them. Maybe I don't belong." Kareem rose from his chair, his voice calm but firm. "You belong because you've earned your place with sweat and blood. You belong because you see what they cannot, the men at the bottom, and you belong because you are my son, whether you accept it today or 10 years from now." Malik's jaw tightened. "But I'm not just your son. I'm my mother's son too, and I can't forget the years she carried me alone." Kareem's expression darkened with grief. "Nor should you. But there are truths about your mother you don't yet know. Truths she never told you." Malik frowned. "What do you mean?" Kareem hesitated, his voice dropping. "There were letters she wrote but never sent. They may hold the answers you're searching for." Malik's chest tightened. Letters? The thought gnawed at him long after he left the office. He would find them soon enough, and with them, perhaps, the final piece of a story that had defined his life. The door to his mother's old apartment stuck as if memory itself were holding it shut. Malik leaned his shoulder into the wood until it gave, and the stale breath of a quiet home drifted. Over him, old cotton, furniture polish, a trace of lavender she had used even on the hardest weeks. He closed the door gently and stood in the narrow entryway, listening to the muted hum of the city outside, feeling the hush that always followed grief. Months had passed since the funeral, yet the room still waited in her shape. Cups nested just so, a pair of house, slippers tucked beneath the sofa, a sweater folded on the arm of a chair as if she meant to return before nightfall. He moved deeper, switching on a lamp whose shade wore the faint thumbprint of time. The light warmed the modest living room, a sagging bookshelf with paperbacks arranged, by color rather than author, a narrow table holding a cracked porcelain bowl, full of mismatched buttons, a framed church program from a service years ago where his mother sang, her alto steady enough to make strangers close their eyes. Everywhere he looked, he saw her thrift and care. She had made beauty out of almost nothing, the way some people make music from a broken piano. The kitchen was as he remembered from long nights after double shifts. 2 mugs beside the sink, one chipped and still his favorite because she let him claim it when he was 10. He opened the cupboard and found the tin where she kept receipts, the rubber band around them brittle with age. There were grocery slips with items circled and crossed. Notes to herself in careful cursive: rice on sale, Tuesday, call clinic again, do not skip pills. He traced the ink, feeling the map of her private battles, the arithmetic of survival done at the edge of exhaustion. Her bedroom had always been the quietest place in the world. The curtains filtered the city into a warm dusk even at noon. The quilt she had stitched, from old dresses, lay smoothed and perfect, each square a season of their life. Malik touched the quilt and thought of winter nights they spent under it counting. Bus fare, saving for shoes, promising each other that tomorrow would be kinder. He opened the top dresser drawer and found neat stacks of scarves, each folded to the width of her palm. Beneath them, an envelope held clippings, a scholarship notice from the church newsletter he had never received in time, a printout of an article on workplace rights. At the meat-packing plant where she cleaned floors for a year, a photo of him. At 13, grinning with a cracked tooth he would keep because she loved it. He searched the closet last. It was shallow and overstuffed, smelling faintly of cedar and soap. Coats crowded against each other. At the back, covered by a folded blanket, he noticed a scuffed leather box with a brass clasp that had lost its shine. The box was heavier than it looked. He set it on the bed and ran his thumb over the seam, feeling the tremor that comes when a door inside the heart is about to open. The clasp resisted and then yielded. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper softened to silk, lay a bundle of envelopes bound with ribbon that had once been red. He lifted them as if lifting a sleeping bird. The envelopes were addressed in his mother's hand, some to Kareem, some to herself, 1 or 2 to my boy, as if she meant him to find them only after she could no longer speak. He took the top letter to the chair by the window and sat with his knees angled toward the light, the way she used to read in the afternoons when the sun made the dust glow like a slow snowfall. His fingers shook as he slid a nail under the flap. The paper smelled faintly of soap and starch. He began, Kareem, I will not send this. I do not deserve to send it. I left because I was afraid and proud at the same time, a foolish combination that can sink any life. You were building a world with your name on it. I could not make a sound inside that noise. When I learned I was pregnant again, I heard only the echo of your calendar pages. I imagined your face, not cruel, just absent, and I could not bear it. Forgive me for making a story out of fear and calling it protection. The words blurred, he blinked them clear. Another letter lay beneath it, dated a month later. The ink slanted hard, as if written through tears. I lost the baby. I did not tell you because grief makes cowards of the stubborn. I told myself it was a sign to stay away. I told myself you would blame me for running. The hospital sent me home with a paper I folded into the smallest square I could manage. I tucked it into a book and tried not to open either. Malik stopped reading and pressed his knuckles to his mouth. He set the letter down and stood, pacing the narrow room until the carpet remembered the shape of his path. He had imagined many explanations for his mother's silence: anger, betrayal, necessity, but not this compounded sorrow. Not the way shame can multiply in an empty apartment until it convinces you the door should stay locked forever. He returned to the chair and read on. I told our son that you left us. I thought anger would make him strong, that it would harden him against the cold that lives in poor neighborhoods and the rooms where people decide what the poor deserve. It did make him strong, but it also built a wall between him and a truth I could not face. If he is reading this now, I am sorry. I took the simple story because I was too tired for the complicated mercy. Some envelopes were thinner, a single page folded neatly. Others were thick with second thoughts. One began as a confession and turned into a ledger of gratitude. Names of women from the church who brought casseroles when he was sick, Mr. Alvarez the super who changed the lock for free when a neighbor rattled their doorknob at 2 a.m., a teacher who sent home, a stack of used novels with a note for Malik who reads like, "The store will close." There were lists of songs she hummed while ironing, prayers for the boy who slept too hard because he worked too late, a sketch of the bracelet he wore, with a line beneath it, "His father gave this to us." I kept it near so he would never be entirely without him. He found a hospital discharge slip folded around a small rosary she had never carried. The slip named "No Father" and offered no comfort, only instructions written in clinical phrases that translated into "try not to weep in the grocery aisle." He found a pawn receipt showing she had sold a gold brooch he had never seen, dated a week before his first school trip, because the permission slip had needed money she did not have. It was as if the box gathered every small sacrifice into a testimony. Deeper in the stack, a letter addressed to my boy had been written in the uneven strokes of illness. "If you are reading this, I am leaving the house by the long hallway where mothers go when they have no more errands. I should have told you earlier. Your father never stopped searching. I saw his face on television one winter in a story about a tower opening, and I knew that same stubborn kindness I once married. I kept telling myself I would write him before the cold turned mean. Then the mean came. I fed you lies because I told myself they would keep you warm. If there is any justice in my mistakes, it is that you are strong enough to open this box and walk past what it tries to guard. The bracelet you wear is not a souvenir. It is a bridge. Cross it if you can. Forgive me if you can't. I have loved you with the shape of my whole life, even when the shape was wrong." He let the letter fall gently to his lap and leaned back until the chair creaked. The apartment felt larger now, not emptier, just honest. He stayed there a long time, letting her words settle, letting the child inside him stop shouting long enough to hear. He thought of nights she sat with her back against that window, stitching fear into silence, choosing pride because it was less heavy than shame until it wasn't. He thought of the day she pressed the bracelet onto his wrist and said, "Keep this. It is the good ending even if we do not reach it." He had not understood then. He understood now. He gathered the letters back into order, smoothing corners, a ritual of respect. On the dresser he found a narrow notebook with phone numbers written on the inside cover. 2 were women from church, 1 was the clinic, 1 was a shelter she had volunteered with once his hours were steadier. A scrap of paper tucked inside held a list labeled, "What I will tell him when I am brave, that his father loved him, that fear is not, the truth even when it is loud, that the world is both cruel and kind, and a person must become the latter to survive the former." On his way out, he stopped in the kitchen and opened the tin of receipts again. At the bottom lay a small photograph he did not remember. It showed his mother at a community fair, hair wrapped in a bright scarf, eyes lit with a joy she hadn't often worn at home because she'd wanted him to have it instead. On the back, in the same small cursive, she had written, "Send him this when you forgive yourself." It was never mailed. When Malik returned to the tower, moonlight made the glass look like water. He rode the private elevator alone, feeling the strange vertigo that comes when the ground you have walked all your life is not the ground you stand on now. Kareem was in his office with the lights low, the city spread beneath him like a circuit board. He rose when Malik entered, eyes immediately locating the bundle in his hands. He did not speak. He did not claim the moment. He simply waited. "She wrote the truth down and hid it," Malik said quietly, placing the letters on the desk as if setting a child to sleep. "She left because she was afraid and proud, and because the story she told herself was easier than asking you to prove the one she wanted. She was pregnant. She lost the baby. She told herself coming back would make the grief louder. And she told me you left because it was the only way she could live with having run." Kareem's face folded, not with surprise. He had already encountered enough loss to recognize it in any form. but with the specific grief of a man who has just been handed the exact weight of what he missed. He reached toward the letters and stopped, fingers hovering, then drew them back, as if asking permission. "Read them," Malik said. "They are yours as much as they are mine." Kareem opened the first with care, his eyes moving steadily, a hand lifting, now and then to press against his brow as if the bones needed bracing. He read for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, his voice was raw. "I would have forgiven her the second she knocked on the door. I would have carried her grief with mine. I would have carried both of you." Malik nodded, the motion small and honest. "I think she knew that. I think that's why she couldn't face it." They sat across from each other, the letters lying between them like a patient on a table. No apology could change the past. No revelation could refill the years. Yet the room felt joined instead of divided, as if two maps once drawn by different hands had been laid on top of each other, and the landmarks finally aligned. Malik placed the hospital slip on the desk. Kareem read it, then closed his eyes, lips moving in a prayer not spoken aloud. "She left me a list," Malik added after a moment. "Things she would tell me if she were brave. One of them was that fear is not the truth, even when it is loud." He met Kareem's gaze. "I don't know how to forgive a ghost, but I can stop being angry at a man who was not in the room where the story was written." Kareem exhaled, the sound a broken thing becoming whole. "Then we begin there, not at forgiveness as a finale, but at the truth as a floor to stand on." They went through the letters together, page by page, not to excavate pain but to name it. Kareem explained the leads he had chased, an address in Chicago that turned into a bakery with no forwarding names, a church in Houston where a pastor remembered a woman who sang like sorrow but never signed the registry. Malik described winters when heat sputtered and they boiled water on the stove, the kindness of a neighbor who slid $20 under the door when the lights went dark. Each story replaced accusation with detail, and detail has a way of making blame smaller than love. When the clock neared midnight, Kareem opened a drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. He set it beside the letters and lifted the lid. Inside lay the twin of the bracelet on Malik's wrist, the same fine chain, the same small plate engraved with lathe in Arabic letters. He held it in his palm a moment, then extended it. "I kept this as a promise," he said. "Not that you would return, because I had no right to demand that of fate, but that if you did, I would choose you before everything I built to forget you. Wear it if you want, or keep it in a drawer, or give it to a son someday, and tell him the truth before fear can speak." Malik looked at the bracelet and then at the letters. He did not take it yet. He let the possibility sit between them like a candle not yet lit. "I will cross that bridge when my feet remember the ground," he said softly. "For now, I will carry these." He gathered the letters back into their ribboned bundle and held them against his chest the way one carries a book that finally belongs to them. They left the office together, father and son walking side by side down a corridor that had seen only one set of footsteps for 25 years. In the elevator, their reflections stood shoulder to shoulder in the mirrored steel, two faces made from the same lines in different weather. Neither spoke, neither needed to. The city spread below like a promise, waited for whatever they would build on the floor the truth had given them. The morning Malik unveiled his plan, the conference room held its breath. Models of towers usually sat on this table like trophies. Today a different shape occupied the center, cardboard massings of low and mid-rise buildings wrapped around courtyards, sketched trees and a playground, sketched in pencil where the sun would fall warmest in winter. The title slide on the wall read the Foundation Initiative. He stood beside the model in a plain jacket and open collar, no tie to prove anything, and let the room come to him instead of chasing approval that would always move an inch if he reached for it. He began with an image instead of a number. A worker stepping off a bus at dawn, hands already sore, heading into a shift that paid enough to keep him housed 2 neighborhoods away from the job he built. He described a different ending. Housing within a walk of the site, ground floor childcare opening at 5, a clinic in the next building to catch a cough before it becomes a debt, a grocery co-op with prices that didn't punish the tired, The buildings would be beautiful because beauty is not a reward for wealth. It is a condition of dignity. They would be owned not only by the company that financed them, but by a community land, trust that would keep them affordable when markets tried to teach them otherwise. When the slides advanced to the apprenticeship diagrams, Malik's cadence shifted from vision to blueprint. The laborer to leadership pipeline would not be a brochure. It would be a timetable with wages that respect time. Practical coursework would run on staggered schedules so a mason could study safety management without losing hours. Foremen would learn conflict resolution as seriously as load calculations. Graduates would move into supervisory roles and earn equity units that vest into down payment credits. So the next move isn't sideways but upward into a mortgage that doesn't eat their sleep. Numbers came last, not because they mattered least, but because they mattered differently. Accidents drop when training is real, insurance follows. Turnover slows when people can see their future, recruitment follows. City partnerships accelerate when outcomes match speeches. Incentives follow. Malik didn't promise miracles. He documented savings gathered where waste hid. In rush jobs, in rehiring cycles, in lawsuits that never need to exist when respect is built into the schedule. He closed the laptop and left the model standing as if to say, the math is here, but so is the life it will touch. The first hand in the air belonged to Douglas Hayward. He wore the same posture he had at the last meeting, a lean of practiced skepticism that had made younger executives fold for years. Mr. Al-Farouk, he said, looking at Kareem, not Malik. We back skyscrapers because we understand their yield. This is social engineering dressed up as housing. Where is the premium? Malik did not look at Kareem to rescue him. He answered as a builder speaks to another builder who has forgotten what steel is for. The premium is time we don't have to buy back later, he said. Every dismissal, every injury, every resignation is a bill you pay in silence. The premium is a workforce that doesn't burn out and doesn't break. And if that isn't a language you like, try this. Cities are voting with incentives for outcomes they can measure. We will become the partner they choose first. Murmurs rippled, not with awe, but with the recognition that a door had been opened they would have to name. Hayward cleared his throat, ready to press, but Kareem spoke before he could. We didn't build this company by copying the safe bet, he said, voice even. We built it by making the safe bet become the obvious one after we moved first. He didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. The room had already learned what happens when he does. Approval did not fall like applause. It arrived like weather. Quiet, inevitable, one hand at a time. A vote was called. A margin was recorded that would look narrow in the minutes and wide in the memory of the men who hesitated. Malik didn't smile when the motion passed. He exhaled and nodded once, the nod of a man who had to be in the ground at 6 tomorrow to make this real. Groundbreaking took place on a parcel most had ignored for years, a fenced rectangle of asphalt that used to be a parking lot, that used to be a freight yard, that used to be a piece of the city nobody claimed. The first shovel was ceremonial, but the second bite of earth was already measured for utility locates. Children leaned on the fence while their parents watched with the wary hope that comes from too many promises spoken and unkept. Malik walked the perimeter with site maps under his arm and paused often, not for photographs but for conversations. How loud will this be at night? Will the sidewalks be salted in storms? Is there a place for elders to sit where the wind won't knife through? He wrote answers, not reassurances, and returned them the next week with corrections to show he meant it. The program filled faster than the billboard predicted, not because the ad budget was generous, but because word of mouth is still the strongest currency in neighborhoods that remember who shows up. Carpenters with 20 years of skill and no certificate sat next to 19-year-olds who could square a frame. By feel, both left with schedules and an instructor's phone number that rang to a person, not a queue. Safety sessions were taught by supervisors who had once been screamed at by men like Ethan Cole and decided that the day after rage could be different. On Fridays, a nutritionist from the clinic held lunch and learns under the canopy and answered questions that had lived in the back of throats for years. How to keep blood sugar steady on night shift, what to say to a doctor when. English is a blunt instrument. Which boots won't ruin your knees by 40. Karim kept his distance at first, not from the project but from the stage. He stood on site visits in a plain jacket and asked practical questions because he had learned the cost of speeches. When reporters pointed a microphone toward him, he pivoted them toward the crew leads whose names never made press releases. The camera recorded calloused hands drawing chalk lines, and for once, the story led with those lines instead of the men behind them. When the city's housing commissioner toured, Karim stayed in the back of the group, while Malik explained soil remediation and the porosity of the new pavers that would keep the courtyard from turning into a lake every April. A commissioner's aide whispered, "He should run for office." Malik heard it and smiled without humor. He preferred building things people could sleep inside. The lawsuit against Ethan Cole concluded like most such matters do, without theater. With documents, with checks that were not gifts but acknowledgments. Several workers received compensation and, more important to Malik, formal letters clearing them of write-ups that had followed them to new jobs like a shadow that won't stop miming you. A clause required Cole to complete certified training in workplace harassment and safety supervision before he could hold any position with authority again. Malik didn't attend the closing. He declined the invitation to deliver a statement. Justice had been the point. Headlines were a byproduct he could live without. Months crept into a shape the project managers called a schedule, and the neighbors called proof. Walls rose around courtyards seeded with grasses that bend instead of break in wind. Brickwork ran in long, steady courses because the crew had the time to be careful. A small bookstore leased the corner bay and promised to stock bilingual. Children's sections and a shelf for paperbacks plumbers read on break. The child care center's sign went up in colors bright enough for a tired child to spot from half a block away. The clinic painted its waiting room with a shade that looked like patience. On the first truly cold morning, steam rose from the vents while a line formed. For coffee set out beside the gate, no one checked a badge to pour a cup. Another board review arrived on the calendar with the same air of inevitability that comes before a storm. Hayward came armed with charts about interest rates wearing anxiety like cologne. He gestured to a slide where costs had stepped beyond their earlier estimate by a percentage that looked larger on a projector than it felt on a ladder rung. Malik listened without fidgeting. When it was his turn, he didn't defend overages with poetry. He placed 2 photographs on the table. The first, an emergency room bill. From 3 winters ago when a carpenter with the flu had worked through it, until pneumonia knocked him into debt. The second, a ledger from the clinic, next door showing how early intervention had cut lost hours in half. He slid a third sheet across, insurance claims from the company's other sites compared with the foundation build. Fewer injuries, fewer delays, fewer resignations. He didn't underline the conclusion. Numbers tell the truth plainly when you let them speak. Karim watched the room learn. It is a rare sight, a room of men trained to know, deciding instead to understand. When the vote closed, the margin widened enough that even the minutes would have to admit it. Hayward didn't congratulate Malik. He closed his folder and stared at the model a beat too long, then nodded. Once, the nod of a man who sees the direction of wind and turns his sail before his ego snaps the mast. By spring, the first families rolled paint on living room walls they would live behind longer than a lease can promise. A boy balanced on a stool while his mother guided his wrist to make an arch into a sun. Elders walked the courtyard at a pace that made time adjust to them. Benches were set where the wind broke because someone had written it down months ago and someone else had remembered. The bookstore hosted a reading night once a week and learned how to pause when a shift changed so a man could step in, claim a chair, and let a poem ring his bones like a tuning fork before he went home to sleep. Fridays became a tradition, first accidental, then deliberate. Malik would knock once on Karim's apartment door out of habit, and then walk in without waiting, setting a paper bag on the counter with ingredients he knew by heart, lentils, onions, cumin, the lemon his mother would have insisted he not forget. They cooked together the way men do who are still learning the language of a kitchen, on equal terms, quietly, with jokes that ask permission by their gentleness. They did not talk about the years that were gone as if conversation could excavate them. They spoke. of the week's small victories, like men placing stones around a young tree to keep it steady. Sometimes they read one of Amina's letters aloud, not to reopen a wound, but to listen for the seam where sorrow had been stitched with intention. Sometimes Karim would take the twin bracelet from his pocket, not as an argument, but as a question he refused to force. One night, as the soup simmered, Malik reached across the counter and held it a little longer than before. He didn't put it on. He set it beside the salt, the way a traveler sets his keys, somewhere he will remember in the morning, and they ate. On the day the foundation buildings opened, the city sent a ribbon for cutting and a podium for speeches. Karim stood to the side and did the rarest thing men of his stature do. He asked to go last. Community partners spoke, not in platitudes but in addresses with cross streets and dates. A tenant representative thanked the site crew by name. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed up as if the sky were also new. When Malik stepped to the microphone, his eyes found the crew first. He told a plain story. He had been a laborer who carried what was too heavy because a man needed to prove he could, or else he might lose the day's wage. He had been the son of a woman who pressed a bracelet into his hand like a map to a place fear said didn't exist. He had learned that justice isn't a thunderclap. It is a schedule that respects breath. He said they had built something that would still be kind 10 years from now. And kind is a word business forgets until it sees what it costs to be cruel. He didn't thank investors until the end, not to snub them, but to remind them what they were investing in. People whose names would never be printed on prospectuses, but whose lives would make the line items true. Applause rose the way good weather does, steady, everywhere at once. Karim came forward last, as promised, and didn't retell the project in a louder voice. He looked at his son and then at the crowd and said only this: we build what we are willing to be measured by. Today we measure ourselves by whether children sleep without hearing fear in the hallway. He stepped back and let the ribbon fall. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the cameras had wandered off in search of a different story to frame, Malik walked the courtyard alone. He paused by the bench where the wind softened and sat, elbows on knees, watching a father show his daughter how to wobble across the pavers on a scooter. He thought of the letters in the box at home and the dinner waiting in a kitchen that used to be a stranger's. He thought of the bracelet on the counter beside the salt and knew he would put it on when it felt like memory and not proof. As dusk folded into the courtyard and the lights along the path blinked awake, his phone buzzed with a text. From the clinic director, first full day complete, no urgent visits, 2 new sign-ups for preventive care. A second message arrived from a crew lead. 3 apprentices passed there. First safety certification. Celebration Monday, cake promised. A third message came from an unknown number with no punctuation and too much space between the words to be anything but humility wrestling with tone. I'm sorry. I have a job. I am learning. I know I can't undo it. It was from Ethan Cole. Malik stared at the screen a long time, neither replying nor deleting, then saved the number under a single letter so the record would exist without fanfare. Some stories end, others are stored in drawers until the day arrives to take them out gently. He rose and walked slowly toward the gate as families carried boxes up stairwells that smelled of new paint and lemon oil. The city beyond the fence still had more problems than one project could repair, but the rectangle of ground beneath his feet had become honest. That was not enough for a headline, but it was enough for a life. At the corner, a boy waved with the solemnity children reserve for people who might be important later and shouted, "Hey, Mr. Malik, we got a tree." Malik waved back and kept walking, smiling at the science of small forests. You plant enough saplings in the right soil, and in 10 years, they forget they were ever fragile. That night in the kitchen, he lifted the twin bracelet from the counter and turned it in his palm. The engraving caught the light, his name in another alphabet. A bridge laid long ago, patient as metal. He slipped it on next to the one his mother had given him. The two rested together with the soft clink of things that were always meant to meet. Karim said nothing. He simply reached for the ladle, filled a bowl, and set it in front of his. Son, the way fathers do when the ceremony is over and the living continues. The city's first hard frost arrived without ceremony, turning the courtyard silver before sunrise and teaching the new maple leaves to let go in a language only trees speak. A year had passed since the first shovel broke the asphalt of a forgotten lot. The foundation buildings now breathed like something living, windows glowing at dawn, footsteps, tracing routes that used to be empty, children inventing games only they could referee. From the street, the project read as brick and glass from the inside it, read as time returned. Minutes no longer spent on buses, hours no longer spent deciding which bill could wait to keep the lights from blinking, days no longer spent searching for a clinic that would answer the phone. Malik carried a stack of reports into the boardroom with the ease of a man who had memorized not just the numbers, but the faces behind them. He laid out pages with columns that looked unremarkable to anyone who had never poured concrete. Incident. Rates reduced by 31%, worker retention up 43%, apprenticeship graduation at 79% with a second cohort already oversubscribed, insurance premiums adjusting in the company's favor. For the first time in years, city incentives triggered by targets met instead of promises made. He didn't gild the margins. He placed beside the spreadsheet a photograph of a crew standing shoulder to shoulder under a banner hand-painted. By their kids, we build and we stay. And then he let the arithmetic and the image do what arguments rarely can. Douglas Hayward arrived later than he liked, having flown overnight, from a meeting in a city that offered fewer questions than answers. He sat, measured the room the way a hunter measures wind, and said nothing until the last slide faded. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to concede or to praise. It was to ask for the next phase plan. Malik passed him a binder labeled with a date instead of a promise. Hayward turned a few pages, stopped when he reached the line item for clinic expansion, and tapped a fingernail against the paper without the old impatience. "Double this," he said, not looking up. "It buys us years we don't have to borrow back." The vote that followed was unambiguous enough to make the minutes look like a formality. The meeting adjourned without a speech. Out on site, the winter protocols clicked in with the precision of a crew that had practiced until the choreography looked like instinct. Salt was laid where black ice liked to hide, scaffolding netting tested for wind shear, heat, lamps positioned so hands could return to their job without the sting that leads to mistakes. Apprentices rotated through cold weather safety drills. The foreman who ran the sessions kept a checklist. That included not just equipment but tone, because a voice can crack a day as easily as a bad weld. On Friday, the clinic held a flu shot day under the canopy with a pot of soup steaming beside the table. The line moved faster than paperwork usually allows because the receptionist knew names by heart. A carpenter joked that he felt like he was cheating by not getting sick that winter. The nurse replied he had earned the right to cheat suffering. The bookstore on the corner turned into a third place without trying, its bell announcing the hour the way church bells once did. On Thursdays, a reading circle gathered at the back with construction gloves set in a pile like hats in a foyer. The manager learned to keep a shelf stocked with bilingual picture books that paired colors in 2 languages and a biography section that included tradesmen and organizers whose names would never be mistaken for the usual canon. The child care center held its winter recital in the lobby one Saturday. Floor polish could not keep chalked hopscotch squares from appearing by Monday morning. Not all letters arrived on paper. Some took the shape of footsteps retraced. One afternoon, months after the lawsuit ended, Malik met a man at the edge of the site who kept his hands in his pockets as if keeping them from old habits. He had the look of someone deciding how to hold his own shoulders. "I finished the courses," the man said without introducing himself. "The ones the settlement required. I know that doesn't make me good. It just means I finally learned the names for harm." Malik listened without easing the man's discomfort and without tightening it. The conversation was short. It ended without forgiveness or condemnation, only with a suggestion, if the man truly wanted to account for what he had been, he could volunteer at the night sessions teaching new supervisors how to set a standard without breaking a spine. Months later, Malik heard, secondhand, that the man showed up every Tuesday with his notebook open, and his voice low, taking questions like penance and leaving after the chairs were stacked. In the quiet between storms, Malik drove alone to the apartment where the lavender smell had thinned. He carried a small framed copy of a photograph into the bedroom and set it on the dresser. His mother at the community fair, scarf bright, smile truer than he knew at the time. The walls had been repainted by the new tenant, but the room still held the geometry of a woman who counted pennies into futures. He placed a single folded page beside the frame, a letter addressed to my boy, copied in his hand so the original could rest. When he left, he locked the door the way she always had, turning the key twice, not out of fear, but out of respect for rituals that keep the world from tipping. The foundation buildings received a name on a plaque that didn't try to outspeak the wind: Amina Commons. The dedication wasn't an event as much as a gathering. There were no velvet ropes and no stage lights, just neighbors and crews and a table with paper cups filled with tea. Kareem stood at the edge of the crowd without a suit jacket, his hands ungloved, against the cold as if to prove something only he needed to know. Isabella Ruiz read the inscription because her voice held a steadiness designed for declarations. She did not reveal the story behind the name. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already understood, and those who didn't would learn by living there. That evening, father and son cooked without recipes, measuring cumin by memory, and lemon by the kind of precision that comes from being wrong once. Malik set the twin bracelet beside the cutting board again, then slid it back onto his wrist. After washing his hands, the metal warming to him as if it had waited decades for skin, Kareem chopped onions with the concentration of a man who solved most problems, with contracts, and was teaching his hands to negotiate with food. They ate at the counter because the table felt like formality, and formality had done enough harm. Conversation moved from the day's details to the long arc neither of them tried to narrate. Any more, they had learned that some histories prefer to be honored by what comes next. Spring announced itself early. The maples at Amina Commons pushed green so earnestly that even commuters noticed. A father taught his daughter to ride a bicycle across the courtyard, his palm steady at her back until it wasn't, and when he let go, she didn't look back to ask if he had. She rode a wide circle and returned grinning, a wobble in the front wheel, triumph in her breath. On the bench where the wind broke, two elders argued cheerfully about the merits of sand versus salt, producing at least 3 proverbs and 1 recipe. At dusk, the path lights clicked on, not bright, just enough to admit. They cared whether someone found their keys before the dark deepened. The second-year cohort of apprentices posted their exam scores on a bulletin. Bored with the celebratory vandalism of checkmarks in thick pen, the clinic expanded hours and hired a social worker who had the gift of asking a third question after the first 2 opened the door. A statistics student from the community college helped track outcomes for a class project and discovered an odd correlation. The reading nights at the bookstore predicted attendance at the safety trainings the following week. When Malik heard this, he laughed out loud and then didn't, because it made too much sense. People who discover their voice in one room will use it in. On a soft Sunday, Kareem and Malik drove out of the city to a cemetery, where the grass was kept short enough that grief couldn't hide in it. They brought no flowers because the flowers they could afford were out of season, and the season they could afford was memory. Malik knelt and placed his palm against the cool stone, tracing the letters of his mother's name with a touch careful enough to change nothing and still name everything. He talked the way a son talks when he finally believes his voice can cross the distance. About renting units that face the morning light, about a boy learning long division at the kitchen table without a knot in his stomach, about a woman who opened a corner bakery across from the bookstore and could close at 5 because the rent didn't demand her soul at 7. Kareem stood back, giving his son the first of every silence, and then stepped forward to set a small velvet box at the base of the stone. He wasn't giving it away. He was naming the place where it had belonged all along. "We could not carry you back," he said quietly, "so we carried forward what you loved." No wind came to take the words. They stayed where they were put. When they returned to the city, a meeting waited that no calendar could schedule. A child had been born that afternoon to one of the first families in Amina Commons. The superintendent texted a photograph with the permission that matters. Parents, smiling, newborn blinking at a world that had planned for her arrival. Malik saved the image without a folder because some files should be found by accident later, when a day needs a door into the good. At the next company-wide gathering, Malik stood not behind a podium, but among the crew. He didn't tell a story, he offered a measure. "We will know we are doing this right," he said, "when the men who lay brick can sleep near the brick they laid, when no one is forced to choose a wage over a body, when a foreman's power is measured in how little shouting he uses to make a day run straight." He looked around the room and found the restless faces, the ones that want to be convinced by deeds alone. "You don't have to believe me because of my last name. Believe me, because you can walk across the courtyard and ask anyone whether we kept our word." Applause followed, but he had already stepped away. He preferred the conversations that happen after the clapping ends, where a drywaller asks about the elective schedule and a young supervisor admits she's scared of the responsibility, and an electrician suggests a better route for conduit because he knows the ceiling better than the drawings do. Kareem watched from the edge, an old instinct to stand at the center replaced by a new discipline to make room. On a night that smelled like rain planning its entrance, Malik and Kareem walked the length of the courtyard. The path lights made a procession of small halos at their feet. From an open window, someone played a record that creaked in the places old songs creak and then found its groove. A toddler laughed because toddlers treat laughter as if it were the first language, and we all forgot. The bracelets at Malik's wrist clicked softly when he tucked his hands into his jacket, his mother's gift and his father's promise finding each other without fanfare. They stopped at the plaque not to read it, but to stand near it, the way people stand. Near a tree they planted last season to see if it has decided to trust the ground. "You built towers," Malik said after a while. "Not as judgment, but as inventory." "And now?" Karim looked past the brick to the light behind it, the figure of a woman washing a cup, the shadow of a man carrying a sleeping child from the couch to a bed, the ordinary miracles a ledger cannot hold. "Now," he said, "we measure our heights by how gently the roof sits on the rooms under it." They walked on. At the gate, Malik turned back and took in the geometry of the place. Angles, softened by trees, metal waiting patiently for another coat of spring. He thought of a boy shouting, "We got a tree," and of the modest arrogance it takes to plant one. He thought of a woman writing a list titled, "What I Will Tell Him When." I am brave, and how the bravery had arrived late, but in time for the building named for her to fill with the sound of chairs sliding and cupboards closing and alarm clocks set for less punishing hours. The rain began, not hard, just enough to make the pavement confess it was warm under the day's work. Malik lifted his face to it and did not hurry. Beside him, Kareem did the same. They crossed the sidewalk toward a car that would take them to a kitchen, where cumin waited in its jar and lemons waited to be cut. Behind them the lights held steady, and in one window the new baby stirred, and in another a man ironed a shirt he would not have to wear for 16 hours straight. The city kept moving around the small fact of a courtyard that now bent the wind in kindness. It was not a miracle, and it did not need to be. It was what happens when a story that began with absence ends with presence, when a bracelet engraved in Arabic letters is not a relic, but a hinge, and when an empire decides to be measured by who can sleep under it without fear. And if the night listened, and many nights do, it would have heard two men walking without the hunger to arrive. Not because the journey was over, but because the road under them had finally learned their name. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and move hearts. Tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you most. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. Our channel is full of unforgettable tales of love, struggle, and miracles, each one crafted to keep you hooked and give you hope. Stay tuned, because the next story may change the way you see the world.